Our last lecture here on Seminar 20 ended with Lacan's claim on page 83 of our English translation that, quote, object little a has lent itself to be confused with the signifier of the big barred other. And with his wonderful, provocative suggestion that clearing up this confusion is precisely the aim of his teaching. If the first half of Chapter 7 in Seminar 20 is dedicated to unpacking the famous table of sexuation that you see on the screen in front of you, the second half of this chapter is about tracing the intellectual and cultural history of this confusion, from Aristotelian ethics to modern science, after which comes that great Lacanian psychoanalytic corrective. Let's take this one step at a time, starting with Aristotelian ethics. You never thought we'd be talking about Aristotelian ethics this much, but it is arguably one of the central themes in all of Seminar 20 so far. The key theme here in this critique of Aristotelian ethics, in this partial critical genealogy that Lacan purports to be offering. It's a scattered, weird, it's one of the weirdest scattered genealogies I've ever read, but he starts with Aristotelian ethics. Let's see how it plays out. The key theme in Aristotelian ethics, according to Lacan, is fantasy. Masculine fantasy in particular, just as we've been describing it with that slashed S pointing to objet A. The masculine fantasy of the one, we might say, and in more ways than that. I'll thread together a few lines from Chapter 7 of Seminar 20 to show you what I think he's up to here. First, from page 87. When one is a man, one sees in one's partner what one props oneself up on, what one is propped up by narcissistically. What a terrific definition of neurotic fantasy. A barred and lacking masculinized subject reducing partners to parts by which to prop himself up, and ever in service to the narcissistic, self-indulgent goal of feeling not barred and lacking, but fully self-sufficient, by which I mean autonomous, by which I mean one with oneself. Make no mistake, where heteronomy was, autonomy becomes. Or so the fantasy goes, one prop at a time. The phantasmatic aspect of all this, and its root in Aristotelian ethics, becomes apparent a few pages earlier, on page 82. It's one worth reading together, so if you've got your books, grab them and check out page 82 with me. Notice this. Let us simply consider the terms active and passive, for example, Lacan puts forth, that dominate everything that is cogitated regarding the relationship between form and matter, a relationship that was so fundamental and to which each of Plato's steps refers, and then Aristotle's, concerning the nature of things. It is visible and palpable that their statements are based only on, here it is, a fantasy by which they tried to make up for what can in no way be said, namely the sexual relationship. The strange thing is that in this crude polarity that makes matter passive and form the agent that animates it, something, albeit something ambiguous, nevertheless got through. Namely, that this animation is nothing other than the objet A with which the agent animates what? He animates nothing. He takes the other as his soul. Note the subtle logic here. There is no such thing as a sexual relationship, qua oneness with another. An ancient fantasy rushes in to make up for this, and it's a fantasy in which the other functions as a sign of oneself. In other words, a narcissistic fantasy. He takes the other as his soul, Or better still, what I like, and check out Bruce's translator's footnote here, he mistakes the other for his soul. In antiquity, Lacan's suggesting, the little a in masculinized fantasy, that little a in Lacan's formula of fantasy that reads /s lozenge little a, is not just the part or prop to which their partners have been reduced, but an aspect of their partner that's been confused with and mistaken for something believed to be essentially his. Not just essential to his quest for autonomy, but essentially his to begin with. Indeed, his soul. And when this fantasy is itself obscured, mistaken for what it's not, what do we see then? Fantasy misconstrued as love. Hence the term we've been discussing from the start, narcissistic love, which Lacan playfully redubs soul love here. The logic is the same. Phantasmatic figures of oneness with another to supplement or make up for failures to fuse with oneself. All of this is implicit in the passage on page 82 we just read. And Lacan seems confident that we'll make these connections without his help. So he immediately takes another slightly giant step forward, edging deeper into Aristotelian ethics. Again, we're on page 82 with another step forward. Consider what progresses over the course of the ages regarding the idea of a God. That is not the God of Christian faith, but that of Aristotle, the unmoved mover, the supreme sphere. The idea that there is a being such that all other beings with less being than its can have no other aim than being the most being they can be is the whole foundation of the idea of the good in Aristotle's ethics. Now, we've heard a lot from Lacan about these damned universals in recent lectures. Moral, religious, philosophical, they're everywhere. Here, in chapter 7, in the passage you just heard me read, Lacan is thinking axiologically about one universal in particular, the good with a capital G. Beneath the idea of the good in Aristotle's ethics, Lacan's suggesting, is the idea of a supreme being, that unmoved mover, a god of sorts to which the rest of us poor saps can only aspire. If the universals we've discussed qualify as ego ideals, this mythical Aristotelian figure of a supreme being might well serve as an ideal ego instead. And then some. Remember, though, Lacan also insists in Chapter 7 of Seminar 20 that the symbolic is the basis of what was made into God in another passage we just read. So don't let yourself wander too far down this imaginary path of ideal egos. Now, some of you are keen on this, so I'll just make a quick statement and move on. God is the symbolic imagined, which is good enough for now, since this isn't even the nut Lacan is trying to crack in Chapter 7. Notice instead how he returns to the soul a few moments later. It's on page 84, picking up where he left off. If it were true, the soul could not be spoken except on the basis of what allows a being, speaking being to call it by its name, to bear what is intolerable in its world, which assumes that the soul is foreign to it, in other words, phantasmatic, which considers the soul to be here, in other words, in this world, owing only to its patience and courage in confronting it. That is confirmed by the fact that up until our time, the soul has never had any other meaning. What I said earlier about the soul's courage and patience in bearing the world of the true warrant of what makes Aristotle, in his search for the good, come up with the following. Each of the beings in the world can only orient itself toward the greatest being by confounding its good, its own good, with that of the supreme, with that with which the supreme being shines. What Aristotle evokes with the term philia, namely what represents the possibility of a bond of love between two of these beings, can also, manifesting the tension toward the supreme being, be reversed in the way in which I expressed it. It is in their courage in bearing the intolerable relationship to the supreme being that friends, philoi, recognize and choose each other. What then is the supreme being in Aristotelian ethics that you heard in this wonky passage from Seminar 20? The supreme being in Aristotelian ethics is a medium through which friends, philoi, come to love each other, philia. And it's important, the Greek terms that Lacan is choosing here. We'll talk more about it in a minute. The key variable here is that these speaking beings, these friends, these philoi, when they come to love each other, they don't just see their souls in each other. The key point here is that they also see attenuated variants of the good of the supreme being in each other. So it's not just that that motherfucker has your soul, is your soul. It's that that motherfucker is also an attenuated variant on the good of the supreme being. At the heart of Aristotelian ethics, we thus discover two confusions, I think. In our phantasmatic relations with others, we have a tendency to, 1, mistake them for our souls, and 2, assume that our ensuing bond of love, as Lacan puts it, like each of its participants, is mediated somehow, some way, through the universal good of a supreme being. Note, too, the type of love in focus here. Again, the Greek matters. We are not talking about eros. We're talking about philia. Not erotic sexual love, but deep friendship and affection. The Greeks had numerous terms for love. We're not talking about erotic love here. We're talking about philia, meaning deep friendship or affection. Beyond that of the neighbor, this is an intimate friend, so to speak. It's the type of love Plato assumed for his agents, these philosophers. Philosophia is a love of wisdom between friends. Wisdom pursued and developed between intimate friends, we need to add. That's what philosophia means. Love of wisdom. And the type of love in question is that which binds close, intimate friends together. I would just add, too, in the spirit of intellectual history here, that most of these close, intimate friends bound together in their love of wisdom, to back it up from Aristotle into his teacher, Plato, so to speak, they were all masculine subjects, which is in part, but only in part, why Lacan says sex doesn't count here. Read it. It's right there in the pages we're considering. But be mindful as you do so. In antiquity, these close, intimate, masculine friends, they did indeed perform sexual favors for each other. I won't get into the details. You may find it in some other lectures of mine, but not here, not in this series. We don't need it to get at what we're working here. My point is that you might well, historically speaking, to take Lacan at his word when he quickly adds that the soul love in question is homosexual, really look hard at the type of love in question here. When Lacan says that the sole love in question that these philoi, these friends, engage in through mediation of the good of a supreme being, he says it's homosexual, spelled with two M's, indicating that we are indeed talking about masculinity, H-O-M-M-E, man. But notice, he also adds this. He says that the sole love in question, mediated through the good of a supreme being in Aristotelian ethics, is, quote, homo to the hilt. Homo, here spelled without two M's. Again, though, I digress, because this isn't the nut Lacan's trying to crack either. It's those two imbricated confusions that he's after instead. One, a misrecognition of objet A as one's soul, and the other, a misrecognition of the big other imagined as God. In Aristotelian ethics, with all of its homoerotic soul love, right to the hilt, mediated through the capital G good of an imagined big other, we see a profound muddling of things. And this is what's at stake for Lacan. It's the very same muddle of little and big A's that he claims his teaching is designed to sort out. Again, recall that bit on page 83 in this key passage that I told you we're going to have to read numerous times. The aim of my teaching, insofar as it pursues what can be said and enunciated on the basis of analytic discourse, is to dissociate little italicized a and capital A by reducing the first to what is related to the imaginary and the other to what is related to the symbolic. And he goes on from there, as we heard in our last lecture. Let me be clear about all this. Time is short. Let's get right to the point. Soul love, as discussed in Chapter 7 of Seminar 20, is a symbol of imaginary relations between semblables, exactly the way Lacan defines the imaginary as the passage you just heard unfolds. And the supreme being in question here is an imaginary figuration of the symbolic itself. Again, just as Lacan says on page 83. It maps wonderfully onto what he's doing with Aristotelian ethics. It is indubitable that the symbolic is the basis of what was made into God, Lacan says. It is certain that the imaginary is based on the reflection of one semblable in another. What I'm telling you is that in Aristotelian ethics, you see both of these elements blurred together in this lovely mashup of two beings. Soul love is a symbol of imaginary relations between semblables, as discussed here, and the supreme being through which they imagine their love to be mediated is itself an imaginary figuration of the symbolic as such, just as Lacan is describing it here on page 83. It's a wild connection, but I definitely want you to make it. So for me, I think it's hardly surprising to see little and big A's confused and confounded in Aristotelian ethics, to say nothing of barred big others and their signifiers, all of which, on my reading, and not of Lacan but of Aristotle, were well beyond Plato's best students' grasp. Which brings us, I think, to the second major moment in Lacan's critical genealogy of this confusion. Modern science. He jumps from Aristotelian ethics right up to modern science. Lacan highlights two aspects of modern scientific discourse that concern us here. The first marks a significant departure from Aristotelian ethics, but the second, on close inspection, does not. Let's start with the first. The first aspect that Lacan highlights. It's around the theme of knowledge. In antiquity, he says, knowledge was conceived as the fantasy of an inscription of the sexual link. and ever mediated through the unmoving, holy, supreme sphere of God. That is what the break induced by scientific discourse obliges us to do without, Lacan explains. Modern science, unlike Aristotelian ethics, in other words, has no need for God or any other supreme being. Now, I'm not saying that God dies in modernity, and I don't think that's what Lacan is saying here either. I'm just saying that it's in the modern era that we realized that God is lacking, incomplete, and inconsistent. The ancients suspected that shit. The modern era proves it. That God is not a big other, but instead a big barred other. This is what modern scientific discourse discovers on Lacan's reading, and I tend to agree with him here. Now, if you want an algebraic symbol for the epistemic fantasies of antiquity that help us mark out its distinction from what's happening in the knowledge factories of modernity, you can just latch on to that classic Lacanian capital A. The symbol for the epistemic fantasies of antiquity can be readily represented by a capital A. And if you want another couple of letters for modern scientific epistemologies, I would say it's that capital A, but with the addition of a slash through it. And let me be clear. In modern scientific discourse, we don't just encounter the big barred other, but also signifiers of the big barred other. There's an S that you have to add to that slashed out capital A. So much the worse for all those souls of antiquity, Lacan suggests. Notice how he weaves this into his discussion of modern scientific breaks with ancient fantasies of knowledge mediated through universal states and unmoving spheres. It's on page 88. It's a bold move in what I gotta say is like one of the sloppiest conceptual, intellectual, cultural histories I've ever seen. Lacan is just all over the place with this shit. It's tough to bring clarity and coherence to these matters, but that is indeed what we're working towards. So notice how he weaves the discussion of the soul back into what he's saying about modern scientific discourse and its break from ancient fantasies of knowledge. Wait, do you hear that? Do you hear that? Do I hear that? That's right, my friends. You have found me in the midst of San Francisco's glorious Fleet Week. And what that means is that there will be a series of jets flying over my beloved city to the great amusement of idiots galore, many of whom enjoy as masculine subjects on a day like today. Now, I'm not shitty about that. It's annoying as fuck, but I'm not too upset. I wonder, in the midst of this lecture, in the midst of this recording, the jets that you may have just heard fly over, hear that again? I can't help but wonder how they might allow us to recall that the masculine master is always overseeing what's happening and ever present in these narratives. Lacan looks like he's getting into an intellectual history here, but make no mistake, he's got his sights set again on masculine enjoyment, ever in hopes of angling towards the feminine. So when you hear those jets next time go racing over the top of this lecture, ask yourself, how does masculinity fit in here and now? But again, I didn't come here to talk to you about that. What I want to do instead is notice how Lacan just can't let go of the soul at the top of page 88. Now that leads to confusion, he says, because it is difficult for whoever soul loves not to think that everything in the world knows what it has to do. So be very careful to note here the flitting between soul love and a certain type of knowledge, in which everything in the world seems to know what it has to do. It's an elusive point here, but for historians of ancient science, an important one. If Aristotle props up his God with the unmoving sphere on the basis of which everyone must pursue his good, lowercase h on that his, by the way, it is because that sphere is supposed to know what is good for it. That is what the break induced by scientific discourse, modern scientific discourse, obliges us to do without. There is no need to know why. We no longer have any need whatsoever for the knowledge Aristotle situates at the origin. In order to explain the effects of gravitation, we don't need to assume the stone knows where it must land. Imputing a soul to animals makes knowing the act par excellence of nothing other than the body. You see that Aristotle wasn't completely off the wall, except that the body is made for an activity, an enargia, and that somewhere the entelechy of this body, its internal telos, the way an acorn has the entelechy of an oak tree. It's a built-in goal that the ancients often thought of. The entelechy of this body is based on the substance Aristotle calls the soul. Here you might think of the entelechy of the lived body here on earth for ancients like Aristotle being not an oak tree at the end, but instead that supreme sphere of God. We don't need to get too far into it. Lacan sure as fuck doesn't. He's just throwing darts at this board, it seems to me. There is a coherence here, and that's what we're trying to get at. But I wouldn't feel too much pressure to go back and read Aristotle in order to make sense of all this. You can do that on your own, but I don't think you need it to understand what's at stake for Lacan in the midst of all this. In fact, I think we can just sum this up rather simply. If I were going to sum up Lacan's first move in his discussion of scientific discourse, I'd say it amounts to this. There is an epistemic break between supreme knowledge and conscious knowledge. That's the break in question here. For Aristotle, there's this emphasis on supreme knowledge and its attenuated variance. For modern scientific discourse a la Lacan, we have discovery in service not to supreme knowledge, but conscious knowledge. Conscious knowledge of the beings we are here on earth. Speaking beings, indeed. Wait, do you hear that? Oh, that wasn't too good of a one. But it's still there. I can hear it, even if you can't. The jets of masculinity flying overhead. Let's get back to Aristotle. While Aristotle pinned his knowing to divine intervention, just as we've discussed it, Lacan's wager here is that modernity breaks with this by pinning its knowledge to scientific discovery. And by extension, I'm adding here, conscious knowledge. Or so our boy would have us think. In truth, it's far more complicated than this. Remember, again, Lacan is a psychoanalyst. This dude ain't an intellectual historian. Woe unto any of us who read him as an intellectual historian. He's a smart reader of the history of Western thought, but he is not a reliable intellectual historian. But nevertheless, it's worth messing with him on this point. Now, I told you that Lacan highlights two aspects of modern scientific discourse, and that the second, unlike the first, does not mark a significant departure from Aristotelianism. Let me tell you what I mean by this. What antiquity did with the soul, Lacan is suggesting, even in spite of what he's up to here, modernity did with gadgets. Just as ancient subjects often mistook others for their own souls, thereby failing to realize the function of what we now call objet A, modern subjects often mistook their gadgets, devices, and instruments of every sort for essential elements of their lived, breathed existence. And now you know why there's no such thing as it, I almost gag to say it, post-modernity. We live in late modernity, not post-modernity. And that's the reason why, is that we have cast our souls into gadgets. And if you don't believe me, take a hard look at that phone of yours, maybe the phone even in which you are watching or listening to this lecture. Take it out of your pocket, pull it closer to your face, and take a hard look at that phone of yours. Mine as well. What do you see when you look into your relation with your phone? Let me tell you, if ever there were a gadget mistook as an essential element of one's existence, it is that damn smartphone of yours. Mine as well. What I'm trying to tell you is that the social link sustained by modern scientific discourse is just as fantastical as that of Aristotelian ethics, except that instead of imagining your soul in another speaking being, you cast it into a gadget. I think Lacan is especially good on this point, prescient as ever when it comes to the role of technology in lived experience. That's a great way to actually think about what Lacan's doing here. He is a wild and unruly reader of intellectual history, but an incredibly precise and prescient reader of technological futures to come, as embodied in prefigurations of his own era. Let me show you what I mean. Check out page 82. This is where Lacan starts chiming in about these gadgets of the scientific era. Scientific discourse, he says, has engendered all sorts of instruments that we must, from our vantage point here, qualify as gadgets. You are now intimately more than you think subjects of instruments, that from the microscope right down to the radio television are becoming the elements of your existence. You cannot currently even gauge the import of this, but it is nonetheless part of what I am calling scientific discourse, insofar as a discourse is what determines a form of social link. Now, Lacan here tells us that there is no link-up between our phantasmatic subjection to all sorts of gadgets and modernity's subversion of ancient, but no less fantastical, theories of knowledge. He says there's not a link-up here, or at least he says it's very difficult to hold these two aspects of modern scientific discourse in mind. Our fantastical subjection to all sorts of gadgets on the one hand, and the subversion of ancient theories of knowledge on the other. He thinks there's no link up there, and he thinks even if there is, it's really tough to sustain that link. Check it out. Were we to sum this up, it might sound something like this. Between the little a's at work in our relations to technology and signifiers of the big barred other in modern scientific discoveries, we see an epistemic gap that's difficult to close. Lacan's wager here. I disagree. Confused and confusing intersections between little a and signifiers of the barred other are precisely, in my view, what we see in modern science and modern life more broadly, even and especially up until its late configurations of our own era. And if, again, you don't believe me, use that magic phone of yours to text a scientist. You should have a button on your phone, it's an app, text a scientist. Text a scientist and ask them to tell you about the technology on which they rely to do their job in the lab, at the level of scientific inquiry. Indeed, what would the microbiologist be without her microscope? It's an essential element of her existence as a scientist, she'll tell you. Of that, she is very aware. All the more so when the microscope breaks just at the time the funding runs out. I think this is what Lacan means on page 83, in the key passage we considered, where he says little a has been confused with the signifier of the barred other by means of the function of being. Imbrications of gadget and inquiry, object little a's and signifiers of a supremely barred big other. I think they are part and parcel of modern scientific modes of being. Whether you're the one with a smartphone or the one with a microscope, or perhaps both. Now, zooming out a little further here, I told you that Lacan highlights 3 moments in this critical genealogy of his, 2 confusions and 1 corrective. After the confusions of Aristotelian ethics, which culminate in theories of divine knowledge, and the confusions of modern science, which culminate in theories of conscious knowledge, comes the great psychoanalytic corrective, and with it a robust theory of unconscious knowledge. So note that shift. From divine knowledge to conscious knowledge to unconscious knowledge. Aristotelian ethics to modern science to psychoanalysis. That's the move he's making here. Aristotelian ethics premised on divine knowledge and shot through with confusions. Modern science premised on the production of conscious knowledge and replete with confusions of its own. And then along comes psychoanalysis, with the discovery of unconscious knowledge, and thereby correcting the previous traditions in their confusions. Unconscious knowledge, the theory of which goes something like this. And here I'm just quoting from our text, page 88 in particular. There is somewhere in the speaking being something that knows more about things than he does. So you want to know the substance of this corrective that psychoanalysis purports to offer to the confusions of ancient and modern approaches to knowledge? It's that of a certain type of unknown knowing, where there is somewhere in the speaking being something that knows more about stuff than he does. Simple as that, right? There's your unconscious. But only at first glance, it seems to me. When you zoom in on this definition, grab that microscope of yours, especially on that knows more part, I think things get complicated. All of this more, beyond conscious knowledge, is unknown to its possessor. I think that's fair to say about the unconscious. It's a more beyond conscious knowledge that is unknown to its possessor. However, as we've learned, some of this unknown knowledge can become known, just not all of it. Some, but not all, unconscious knowledge can enter the field of conscious knowledge. The rest, beyond the field of conscious knowledge, remains unknown and, as we've learned, fundamentally unknowable. Now check this out, zooming back out again. It's a question of magnitude in these middle chapters. In chapter 6 of Seminar 20, as we saw, Lacan was hot on the unknowable side of the unconscious. And in the first half of chapter 7, he was more interested in its knowable side. In other words, in what can be said of the unconscious. Both, it seems to me, are intimately and crucially related to feminine enjoyment. The unknowable unconscious corresponds to impossible feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic field. And here my eyes are on that second of two formulas in the diagram on the screen in front of you. Not all feminine enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. We've learned this. It is coming to bear here. If the unknowable unconscious corresponds to impossible feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic field, how about knowable unconscious? The knowable unconscious on this reading corresponds to contingent feminine enjoyment within the phallic field. And here my eyes dart up to the first formula of feminine enjoyment that reads, look as hard as you want. You cannot find in existence any one woman, any women, however you want to figure that, who aren't a little to a lot governed by the phallic function. But note this. Unknowable unconscious knowledge and knowable unconscious knowledge, they are both linked in and by way of the feminized body. That's a really important part in all of this. The body of the feminized subject is inscribed with both formulas of sexuation. Which is why, I think, at the end of chapter 7, Lacan asks whether and to what extent contingent feminine enjoyment can speak to impossible feminine enjoyment. Specifically, whether feminine subjects can say what they know about their experience of the latter, and whether we can even pose this question at all. This, for my money, is the most crucial part of what's happening in Chapter 7 of Seminar 20. The passage I like for this is on page 89. It explains this a little more clearly. Lacan says at the top of page 89, it's right at the end of the chapter, there is something, jouissance, regarding which it is not possible to say whether a woman can say anything about it, whether she can say what she knows about it. At the end of today's lecture, he continues, I have thus arrived, as always, at the edge of what polarized my subject, namely, whether the question of what she knows about it can be raised. That is no different from the question whether the term she gets off on, beyond all this playing that constitutes her relationship to man, the term I call the other, signifying it with a big A, whether this term knows anything. For it is in this respect that she herself is subjugated to the other, just as much as man. And then he hits you with the big question. Does the other know? Now, I don't think we're ready to make sense of the second part of the passage I just read, but the first part of this passage is well captured in what you've heard me say so far. Here, in this final riff on page 89, at least the first part of it, Lacan is asking whether and to what extent contingent feminine enjoyment can speak to impossible feminine enjoyment. And specifically, whether feminine subjects can say what they know about their experience of impossible enjoyment. And then he adds this, whether we can even pose this question is also something that must be asked. It's great stuff. Top of page 89. Read it again to yourself. As I consider it, it seems to me we have these two parts that have to be addressed. The first part of this inquiry that he's laying out for us regarding feminine enjoyment is, how do you say what you know about the unknowable? That's the question. That's the first and foremost question here. How to say what one knows about the unknowable. This is the question of feminine enjoyment, as Lacan sees it. Or at least the question, it seems to me, of psychoanalytic theory as it relates to feminine enjoyment. And then there's this second part to the inquiry he lays out here. What does the answer to this question, this first question, tell us about the status of unconscious knowledge, which is not just unknown but also fundamentally unknowable, and thus, as Lacan puts it in Chapter 7 of Seminar 20, radically other? Here, at long last, we reach the molten core of his thought at this point in the spring of 1973. And it goes something like this. There's the big other you know, the big other of what's known, the classic Lacanian big other symbolized by capital A. But there's also the big other you don't know, the big other you can't know, because it's the non-existent big other of the big other. You know. The big other which is no such thing and which we symbolize with a barred capital A. So when Lacan says again and again, even in this chapter of Seminar 20, that there is no big other of the big other, it's these two big others that he has in mind. The one you know and the one you don't, because you can't, because that shit don't exist. There's, in other words, what he defines here as the locus in which everything that can be articulated on the basis of the signifier comes to be inscribed. Here, that great definition of the big other again. We write it with a capital A. And then there's the impossibility, check it out, of any other locus of signifying articulation in which to inscribe this first locus. We write that impossibility as barred capital A. And we signify this impossible big other of the big other in the only place we can, in that locus of signifying articulation beyond which there is no other, namely in that big capital A. When Lacan repeatedly insists that women have a relation to the signifier of the barred other, he means that their contingent enjoyment within the phallic field functions as a signifier of the fact that there is no other field in which to enjoy. An impossible no other field that they nevertheless have access to, but know nothing about, except that they have access to it. Notice how squirrely this gets. That twist is the crucial part here. It's the key to understanding all of this, it seems to me. Just as mystics enjoy saying they experience another mode of enjoyment that cannot be known, and in so doing producing signifiers of this unknowable other enjoyment, the part of feminine enjoyment that contingently pops up in the phallic field always, to some extent, delights in referring to the part which doesn't, because it cannot pop up in the phallic field. And thus, relative to this field, remains existent, insisting there by way of contingent enjoyment, but always from without, as impossible enjoyment. Let me be clear, if possible, here. Enjoyment beyond the phallic function may be impossible, but this doesn't make it inaccessible. And it may be unknowable, but this doesn't mean it's unsayable. Note, I'm not telling you it can be said. I'm telling you that we can say this about it. Enjoyment beyond the phallic function cannot be, and cannot be known because it cannot be said. That is what I'm saying to you. I can say as much. You can say as much, just as I'm doing right now, and just as I hope you also will from here on out. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, more than any other applied conceptual system, I'm wagering here, we learn to say the impossible and to enjoy doing so. Encore. This is a lot, I know. I realize that this is a lot. But it's also this lot, I think, that allows psychoanalytic theory and technique to correct for the confusions of Aristotelian ethics and modern scientific discourse. Remember Lacan's wager in all of this. For thousands of years, objects little a have been confused with signifiers of the barred big other. Only with the advent of psychoanalysis, he claims, do we find a way to effectively pull them apart. So let's end with a question, the key question. What evidence does Lacan provide for this psychoanalytic corrective? Why the diagram on your screen right now from page 78 of Seminar 20. What his formulas of sexuation suggest, the series of vectors beneath them show. It's that the difference between object little a and the signifier of the big barred other comports precisely with the difference between masculine fantasies about feminine subjects and feminine subjects as symbols of something else entirely. Something beyond all this playing that constitutes her relationship to man, as we just heard Lacan put it. That is what is at stake on my reading in this diagram in front of us. What the formulas of sexuation at the top suggest, the elements connected by vectors beneath them demonstrate. They demonstrate that the difference between objet A and capital S next to slashed capital A in parens comport precisely with the difference between masculine fantasies about feminine subjects and the function of feminine subjects as symbols of something else and a lot more different entirely. From the masculine viewpoint, which is always at 30 to 3,000 feet, depending on where the Blue Angels fly over your house, from that masculine viewpoint, the feminized subject appears to be nothing more than an object cause of desire. Hence, the arrow, again pointing from slashed S on the masculine side of this diagram to that little italicized A on the feminine side. Again, we see nothing but fantasy here. There's nothing in there, in this fantasy, about woman as a signifier of the barred other. That sure as fuck ain't present in the fantasy. Nor is there anything in that fantasy about her serving as a signifier of the symbolic phallus or a signifier of the unconscious in all of its knowable and unknowable dimensions. This is what I mean when I say the masculine subject is the one who reduces his partners to parts in order to feel whole. Indeed, he's a wannabe one, and always by way of her reduction to his object cause. That's what's happening on the masculine side of things, and that's the great dilemma in all of this. He simply does not have eyes to see or ears to hear all that she signifies beyond her function as the object cause of his desire. On the feminine side of things, From that point of view, however, there's always more to enjoy than being part of someone else's fantasy. And this is precisely what her being in the world of phallic jouissance says again and again. More than his little a, she's a signifier of the fact that her enjoyment's never wholly in it. Some of it, yes, but not all of it. Some, but not all of her enjoyment is inscribed in and by his fantasy and the phallic function that governs it. Hence, the distinction between little a and slashed woman in Lacan's diagram, the one you've been staring at now for 2 lectures. And tellingly only on the side of femininity. That is indeed where we finally see the distinction between little a, slashed woman, and of course signifiers of those big others that are barred. But also note the vectors extending from barred woman, neither of which point to any element or operative logic of masculine fantasy. Both of the vectors extending from barred woman point elsewhere. And everywhere else they point, relative to the field of phallic enjoyment, and within it masculine fantasy, is technically speaking nowhere. As the signifier of a big other that does not exist, the signifier of the signifier without a signified symbolized by capital Phi, and the signifier of unconscious knowledge in all its knowable and unknowable dimensions, she points us to a host of nowheres beyond the somewhere of phallic enjoyment, but also ever present there in various figures of impossibility. Object little a, yours and mine alike, is not among these figures. And all thanks to the psychoanalytic corrective at work in Lacan's theory of sexuation, as shown in that famous diagram of his at the start of Chapter 7, which has also served as a backdrop for our lectures on this chapter.